In February, as you recall, 73% of the country was covered in snow, 100-year storm. So the red stripes are SPP's territory. The dark blue are temperatures below zero. Three big problems that all happened in the perfect storm. One of them was lack of fuel supply and generators being unavailable. There were problems with coal. There were problems with wind. There were problems with natural gas. All those different generation types that I showed you, a lot of them had problems.
We'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. I want to welcome everyone to the weekly meeting of the Rotary Club of Jonesboro. And we've got our inspirational moment. A bird does not sing because it has an answer. It sings because it has a song. Maya Angelou. Dana Kennedy is going to come up and introduce our program.
How are y'all? Good afternoon. Our program today is on electrical reliability. And I think for most of us, that means if we've paid our electric bill, then the lights come on. And in all fairness, we have two really good electrical providers here in town, City Water and Light and Craighead Electric. But then something happened in February. Can anybody here remember February? It got bitterly cold, and all of a sudden we were being told to turn down our thermostats. And I know all of you did that, so that we could avoid things like unplanned outages or planned outages. So our speaker today is Emily Pennel. She's with Southwest Power Pool. She has led communication projects there for almost 15 years, and she has a total of over 20 years experience in communications, marketing, and special events. Before joining SPP, she worked for the Department of Arkansas Heritage and the Heart of Arkansas United Way. She graduated from Hendrix College and has earned a certificate in business analytics from Harvard Business School. She's joining us by Zoom, so if you will make her the presenter.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. So I'll try to keep this short. There's so much that you can talk about when we talk about the electric grid, which is the largest machine in the world. Let me tell you a little bit about Southwest Power Pool. So we're located in Little Rock. We have about 600 employees. If you have any, folks in Little Rock that are looking for jobs in IT, electrical engineering, we actually hire all kinds of engineers. It's a really great place to work with a lot of, high-tech jobs. We do have a 24/7 operation, and we have a nice facility in West Little Rock. So if you look at this map here, it shows the Southwest Power Pool region, and this is the part of the country for which we help manage the power grid. We don't own the power grid. We don't own any transmission lines. We don't own any generators, but we help utilities such as Jonesboro, Water and Light, Power and Light. I have our members list up, and I saw that you are a member of our energy market. So you can see there are 8 other organizations like Southwest Power Pool. You probably heard the word ERCOT a lot during the winter storm, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, that's adjacent to Southwest Power Pool, that we actually do the exact same thing that they do. We do have 104 member companies across 14 states. And so the ways that we help manage the power grid break down into about 3 categories. We operate a wholesale energy market where organizations like your local utility can buy and sell power. We manage 24/7 grid operations to ensure the grid remains reliable, that we don't have blackouts. And then we also work with our member companies to plan what transmission we need to build in the future so that we can connect customers with electricity. And by the way, y'all feel free to just chime in with questions if our moderator wants to speak up. I can't really see chat, but anybody can feel free to speak up with questions. We have a pretty interesting history. Right after Pearl Harbor, when we entered the World War II and the federal government needed immediate massive supplies of aluminum. Well, as you may know, Arkansas has one of the few bauxite mines I think there might be only 2 in the country. And with Alcoa Aluminum, we had to ramp up production so that we could produce more and more aluminum for the war effort. There was not enough electricity in the entire state of Arkansas to run the Alcoa plant 24/7. So 11 utilities pooled their power to run Alcoa to make aluminum, and that's how the power pool got started. And then after the war, we decided there was a lot of value in utilities working together. So we often use the analogy of air traffic control to describe what we do. Just like air traffic controllers watch the sky and to be sure that airplanes don't crash into each other. They don't own the airplanes. Air traffic control doesn't own the, sky or any of the infrastructure. They're just watching it to be sure that everything is safe. And that's similar to what we do in our control room. We watch the power that's flowing across the region. And if we see issues that are going to cause reliability problems that are going to cause a blackout or any type of issue, then we take action. So we have more of a bird's eye view of the grid. So if you're the city of Jonesboro or you're Entergy, you can see your portion of the grid, but having a regional operator that can see the bigger picture brings a lot of value. So this is a picture from our control room. We have, I think it's the biggest computer screen or, what do you call it, monitor in the state. I think I heard at one point, but we have these just tons of engineers and operators and monitoring systems where we watch the grid and coordinate that regional response. So we are independent. We don't favor one utility over another. We don't favor one fuel type over another. And when we're doing this job of monitoring the electric grid, we're not just doing what we want to do. We're following federal laws and standards, thousands and thousands of pages of regulations that we follow to ensure that we are providing that independent oversight. So if you think about the power grid, it's a very complicated machine. Most of us, we just plug in our phone and we just don't really think a whole lot about where the electricity comes from. I certainly didn't till I started working at SPP. But there's basically the wholesale side and the retail side. So first we have our power plant that generates coal, hydro, nuclear, solar, wind, steps up to the high voltage transmission system. And those are those big transmission lines that you see, along the interstate maybe. This is the part of the grid that SPP works on. Then when that high voltage electricity is stepped down, it goes to distribution lines, which are the lines that you see in your town and on your street, and then they go to your home or business. And so your local utility works on that blue part of this picture here. So we work on the supply side, and then you, the customer, and I'm a customer of Entergy, we're the demand side. So there are 3 different interconnections. So basically the electric grid is broken into 3 parts. There's the Western grid, the Eastern grid, which SPP is part of, although we are starting to have some members in the West, and ERCOT or Texas. Texas did not want to be part of the national grid, and I'm sure that you've heard some commentary about that during the winter storm. There are only a few ties between the East and the West in Texas. So if you see on this picture here, we have about a small amount of transfer capability between Southwest Power Pool and ERCOT or Texas. So I think it's really interesting, all the different types of generators that make our electricity. This is something, again, that I think most people don't think about. This chart on the left is the capacity. This is how much our different generators could produce. And then on the other side is what was actually produced last year. So if we look at this chart, you can see that 31% of energy in the SPP region was produced by wind. That number has grown massively the 15 years that I've been at SPP. I mean, it's, 20-fold. It used to be maybe 5%. Coal was 38%. Last year, nuclear was 3%. Of course, we have Arkansas 1 and Russellville. Solar is small right now. It's 0.3% last year, but it's growing. Oh, wait a minute. I think I'm looking at the wrong chart. I've got this Zoom monitor at the, let me move that. Okay, sorry. So on the energy production, yeah, 30% wind, 31% wind, 30% coal. Natural gas is the other big one. So that was almost 27% last year. Then we had 6% nuclear, 4.5% hydro, and again, a small amount of solar. So solar is really growing. So the main producers of energy in our region are wind, coal, and natural gas. And we'll talk more about what happened with those fuel types during the storm. Okay, so let's talk about what happened in February. Let me talk a little bit about the world that we operate in as far as the rules that we have to follow. There is the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that's FERC. We are jurisdictional to them. And then there's also the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. So basically, do y'all remember the big blackout in, I should have looked that up. I think it was 2005 when New York City blacked out and much of the East Coast was blacked out. After that happened, I'm sorry, it's right there, 2003. After that happened, the federal government said, we need to put more standards in place to stop major blackouts like this. Because before 2005, which is when these standards were created, the electric utility industry was not regulated. You know, banks have been regulated for 100 years. Aviation has been regulated. The power grid wasn't. And so after the 2003 blackout, 2005, 2007 timeframe, we started implementing rules that all the utilities have to follow. And so the government regularly audits us to ensure that we're following the rules. They also tell us how much energy our utilities have to keep in reserve for emergencies. So we do operate under very strict regulations. We do a lot of training. And this is, the federal government, NERC, tells us what we have to train on. They certify our training programs, and then all of our operators have to be certified in their role. So it is a pretty neat career path. Again, when I'm talking to local audiences, I like to talk about this because if you know somebody that you think would enjoy this kind of work, you can become certified to be a grid operator, and they're great salaries and benefits and just interesting work sitting in that control room and helping monitor the power grid. So we do provide lots and lots of training to our operators. And then we also train with our neighbors. So in February, as you recall, 73% of the country was covered in snow, 100-year storm. And and I'll show you this map. This map shows where so the red stripes are SPP's territory. The dark blue are temperatures below zero. So we were right in the heart of the coldest part of the country during the winter storm. So there were three big problems that all happened in the perfect storm. One of them was lack of fuel supply and generators being unavailable. We had problems. There were problems with coal. There were problems with wind. There were problems with natural gas. All those different generation types that I showed you, a lot of them had problems, meaning that they couldn't start or they couldn't run. The second issue was normally SPP, we import and export a lot of energy with our neighbors. Well, a lot of those imports stopped because each region was having to supply their own customers and they didn't have enough to export. And then the third reason, as you probably would guess, is record consumption. People were using more energy than normal. So the fact that we had generators unavailable, more demand than ever, really caused lots of problems. And so if you look at this chart, it shows how much our available generation dropped during the storm. It dropped by 20 gigawatts, which is a lot of energy, just massive drop down. Compared to that blue line is the generation that's usually available. So we had up to 35,000 megawatts of generating capacity that was unavailable. So I think there's somebody from Power and Light on the call. They could probably say better, but I think a 1 megawatt could power a small city. So 35,000 megawatts was a lot of capacity that wasn't there. So this green box shows the time period when SPP had to tell our utilities to take power off the lines. So during this storm, for the first time in SPP's 80-year history, we did have to direct all the utilities across our region. You're going to have to take some power off the system, because if you don't, the system can cascade out of control and we could end up having uncontrolled blackouts. This is a very serious step. I can promise you it's being investigated right now by the federal government, by state governments. Both what happened in SPP, what happened in ERCOT, what happened really across the country. So during this red box, this is when we had to direct utilities to reduce power off the lines. And you can see how high the amount of generation outages were there. Now in SPP, we didn't have days of outages like called for by the regional grid operator like in Texas. We had 50 minutes, we called for 50 minutes of load reduction or demand reduction, 50 minutes on one day, and then it was 3 hours and 20 minutes the second day. So it was about 4 hours of outage that SPP called for. And again, that was very, very serious. This shows you again during those 2 days when we had to call for utilities to take some load and some demand off the system. You can see what the outages were. The yellow is natural gas. We had a lot of problems with natural gas not being available. You can see there were outages with wind, and there were outages with coal. So I think there's been some narrative out there that this was all because of renewables. It's just not the case. We had problems with coal and wind and gas. And the biggest problem, the highest amount of outages, as you can see, were actually with natural gas. And so as you can see in that box there, gas contributed to about 60% of the unavailability. I like this chart because it shows you, so the yellow is supply and the gray is demand. And where the circles are the time periods when SPP had to call for reduction. And you can see that when supply sunk below demand, that's when we had to say, okay, everybody has to take some demand off the power grid, or we're going to have even worse problems. And you can see here on these charts, there's a little bit of white. So if you look at on 216, that white area, that was where there wasn't any supply. So that black line at the top is the demand. And you can see what was meeting demand. We had some wind, some solar, some hydro, and some imports. That purple at the top is imports. So when there's more demand than supply, then that's where we have the problem. So this just shows you, I'm not going to go into all these details, but it was on that. So on that Monday, actually the week before, we started seeing conditions worsening and we began issuing cold weather alerts to our grid operators. We issued, we told our operators to ensure that their generation resources were available. We also told them to start turning on all generation that they could. On that, the 9th, the 11th, the 13th, we were doing more warnings, declaring, hey, situations are getting worse. On that Sunday, Valentine's Day, is when we began asking our member companies to ask the public, which is what you heard, to start reducing their use. And then it was on that Monday when we, in the red, where we had to interrupt demand, or we had to take power off the lines there on that Monday and Tuesday. And then by that following Saturday, we were back to normal operations. So it's a very, very tight conditions. It's something that SPP's never experienced before. So there's a whole lot more we go into about it. But I will say that since then, we have been, like I said, we're FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, has requested reams of data from us, which we're supplying. We're working with our members on a big report on what happened that I'm helping with. We'll be publishing that this summer. And we're just talking with our member companies about what we can do better. There are some ways we could communicate better, and looking at different ways, if we do encounter a situation like this again, just ways that we could improve. But when we talk about the big picture of this event, the 5 things that we would say are that we did early prep. We did begin issuing warnings and alerts. That did help. When we asked the public, like you, to reduce your demand on the system, we do believe that that helped, because demand did begin dropping below what was forecast, and that minimized the amount of interruptions that we had to take. We and our member companies ran every available generator. We imported as much as we could, and our member companies were working very, very hard. I heard a guy from Nebraska saying, we were running our hydro. We were running all the coal we could. I mean, everybody was working very hard. There just simply wasn't enough generation to meet the demand. So we did, reduce system demand by 1.5% on the 15th for 57 minutes, and then 6.5%, which was more, on that next day for 3 hours and 23 minutes. And that was hard. So our member SPP doesn't tell our member utilities how to reduce that demand. We just said within 30 minutes, you have to take 1.5% off the system. And then it's up to each utility to decide how to do that, whether they're going to take industrial customers offline, residential customers offline, whether they're going to rotate. That's up to their emergency plans. But we do believe that these controlled outages prevented uncontrolled blackouts, which would mean, one of our operators described it as, when the system starts tripping on its own, you can't stop it. The operators just have to sit back and watch as things trip off, because a generator will protect itself. And if to protect itself from getting overloaded, it'll just turn off. So we do think that the actions that SPP took and our member utilities took prevented more widespread, possibly severe, and probably very expensive blackouts from happening that could have lasted a lot longer. So I'm not sure how long that was, but I'll stop there and see what questions we have.
This is John Carmack, Craighead Electric Cooperative in Jonesboro.
Oh, great. Hi.
With the proliferation of like solar and wind, we imagine that the solar and wind will become a bigger part of our mix in the future. Mm-hmm. Are we going to, keep being as reliable with our electricity as we have been in the past with these non-dispatchable energy sources in the future?
Well, I'll tell you, that is the question that every day in my 15 years at SPP, I've heard something about managing renewable energy. So for those of you who may not have ever really thought about it before, if the wind is blowing and it's supplying the grid, and then the wind stops blowing, we can't just turn everybody's lights off. We have to immediately replace that wind energy with another type of generation, which is normally natural gas. Coal kind of runs, steadily. There are a lot of things that we're doing in our energy market. We're working on products. There's a ramp product, an uncertainty product, things that we can do in our market to more quickly ramp up resources, to better match the different, types of generation that are on and offline. We're also have worked in recent years a lot on improving our wind forecasting, and it's actually gotten pretty good. With solar, again, that's still new in our region, and I believe that storage is going to have a huge impact on the grid. I remember our CEO 10 years ago saying that when battery storage becomes bigger, it's going to revolutionize the power grid, because if you have a solar farm and you have batteries associated, and during the day when the sun's shining and those batteries fill up, then when the sun goes down, you can use those batteries to supply back to the grid. That's starting to happen. We're starting to see some of those battery installations. I hope that that's going to be part of, or I've heard it will be part of infrastructure, maybe tax credits and such for it. But it's really big, because if you can have some batteries that can dispatch, that can pull from the grid and then sell back to the grid, again, it's not free. Somebody's going to be paying for those batteries and selling them into the market. So I just think there's a lot of technology that has to happen. And you do have to think about, in 30 years, what will the generation mix look like? It might look very different from how it looks today. So those are great questions that a lot of people smarter and more knowledgeable than I am are working on every day.
Along that same line, how long is the battery storage currently available that you mentioned, storing on the battery?
I don't.
Because if it sits there for very long, it's going to lose life, just like it does in a vehicle or whatever.
I don't know a lot actually about the technology. I'm pretty sure that storage is only for a couple of hours right now. I don't know. I just can't answer that question, but we just don't have a whole lot of it on the grid yet. Just like as batteries had to get smaller and smaller and smaller for cell phones and everything else. I think that battery technology, I don't know if any of you invest in the stock market, but there's 100 battery startups out there. And I think the technology is just growing by leaps and bounds. There's speculation that in the future, we'll be able to run the entire grid from wind, solar, biomass, and batteries. And I think we will be able to do a lot of that as technology increases. I think it's still just really new right now.
I was wondering what in general could be done to avoid what happened in February. I've heard about hardening the grid and things like that. What sort of steps could be taken to avoid so much loss of potential power?
So I think winterization of equipment is a huge part of it. And it is hardening the grid. That is a term that we used. The question is, how much do people want to spend? You could, as our CEO like to say, we could gold plate the grid. We could build a power grid that would never have an outage. We could bury all of our transmission lines underground. But do we want to pay for that? Because most of us like to have a utility bill that's affordable every month. And when utility bills go up, people complain, and you have to go to your commission. Mm-hmm. So like if Entergy's my provider, if they wanted to raise rates, they'd have to go to the Arkansas Public Service Commission and say, hey, we want to raise rates because we're going to do this. And so I think as a society, we have to decide to prepare for a 100-year storm or, an event that may or may not happen again for 30 years. How much do we want to invest to prevent? But really, it was a generation issue. And also part of it is demand. If there in the future, let's say people had battery storage at their homes that they could rely on, people were using less power because it's a demand and supply issue, just like anything else. And so if everybody across the region had voluntarily turned off their heat, we wouldn't have had a problem, but people wanted to run their power. So I think probably we just have to sit down with our utilities, and they have to talk with their customers. There's just really not like a one solution to it. I do think that what's interesting about the future of the power grid is right now it's pretty much one way. You produce power, I buy it. At my house, I don't produce any power. I just buy it. But with electric cars, let's say that everybody in this room had an electric car and you could plug your car into the wall at home and be connected to SPP's energy market, and you could sell power back to the market. It's becoming more of a two-way street where industrial customers, even residences, can start participating into the market as well. There are lots of programs across the country. There's some in Arkansas actually with Entergy that's where I allow Entergy to reduce my air conditioning use during the summer, and they pay me $150 or something like that. They don't turn it off, but like if Entergy is experiencing high demand, they can reduce everybody's AC by just a little bit, and they pay you for that. So I think that will help in the future. The more our grid is a two-way street and we can all participate on both sides, I think that there will be a lot more flexibility in how we respond to storms like this. That was a long answer. Sorry.
Hey, Emily, if we saw what happened over the weekend with the Colonial Pipeline hacking, can you either assure us or maybe scare us on the security of the power grid?
Well, all I can say is that at SPP and for any utility that participates in the transmission, the high voltage transmission system, those federal rules I talked about, a big chunk of those are cybersecurity rules. And so it's critical infrastructure protection standards. And believe me, every day at SPP, I hear about SIP standards. We have to take trainings. Yes, we get in trouble and have to pay fines if we don't follow the standards. So I think a big part of it is the industry keeping up with the threats. And that's across any industry. Are we keeping up with the hackers? Because, federal government may say, hey, utilities, you have to do these 500 things to meet our SIP standards. Well, what if the hackers get another step ahead of us, which happened? So we are constantly, and all the utilities as well, trying to keep up and implementing as many safeguards. I mean, we have all kinds of firewall rules. If I'm in a meeting room, I can't just open up an internet port. I mean, so we're definitely aware of the threats. Can't ever say that we're 100% protected because, again, the bad guys keep getting smarter and smarter. I will say there's a group. It's basically it's an information sharing department of NERC, the Electrical Liability Corporation, and they have a real-time reporting system where all the members, within 30 minutes, you're supposed to, or maybe it's shorter than that, but there's all kinds of things like immediately report it, it's immediately shared, and we participate in all of that information sharing as well. And, we deal with the FBI. Our top cybersecurity guy has some type of, security clearance. It's hard. It's hard to keep up with the bad guys. And that's true for, all of industry, really. We're definitely aware and working on it. Well, I appreciate y'all inviting me. Let me just go to the chat here. I just saw we're told that Texas's problems were partially due to being self-regulated. Are they not federally regulated similar to SPP? Yeah, that's a good question. They do have to follow the regulations. I think, I don't know all the ins and outs. There's some regulation that I probably shouldn't even speak to it. I think there are some that they don't, but I know they're under FERC and NERC jurisdiction. A big issue there was that they are electrically not connected very much to the other. So they're independent. They're more of an independent grid. And so when they needed help, you can only supply, it's like if you imagine two straws, connecting the Texas to the other grids, you can only run so much power through a little bitty straw. So, yeah, I could follow up if anybody wants more specifics on that, but yes, they do have to follow at least most of the standards that we do. I should learn more about the differences there. But really it was the fact we exported some energy to Texas, but they couldn't get as much as they needed from the rest of the country. So there's a lot of talks of like, maybe we need to be more electrically connected to the rest of the country.
All right. Well, Emily, thank you for the information. It's all good information. And like I said, it's interesting to see. I guess I didn't realize Texas was not a part of, they were on their own. So learned something new today. All right. So next week we'll be back here. And we'll have Keith Hendrix. He'll cover the triumph and tragedy of the hardest hit unit in Iraq. Thought for the day. What you do has far greater impact than what you say. Unless anybody's got anything else for the group, we will adjourn.